In a cold, sterile laboratory in 1963, a tiny, terrified black and white cat is strapped tightly to a stainless steel operating table. She is not dying from a natural illness. She is not injured. In fact, she has just survived the most terrifying, miraculous journey in human history. A violent, deafening launch into the freezing, breathless vacuum of outer space. She survived the crushing gravitational forces. She survived the terrifying void. She returned to Earth an absolute hero. But the scientists standing over her, holding a syringe filled with a lethal injection, are not here to reward her. They are here to kill her. They are going to end her life simply because they want to cut open her skull to see what the trauma of space did to her brain. This is not science fiction. This is the forgotten, unforgivable betrayal of Felicette, the only cat to ever touch the stars and a ghost erased from the pages of history. When we look back at the space race, we remember the names of the pioneers. We build statues for the brave humans who strapped themselves to rockets. We even remember the animals. We know the name of Laika, the tragic Soviet dog who died in orbit. We know Ham, the American chimpanzee. But humanity has a very selective memory when it comes to guilt. The French space program also wanted to conquer the stars, and they chose an animal known for its independence, its delicate neurological system, and its profound spatial awareness, the domestic cat. But they did not ask for volunteers. They drafted them from the unforgiving streets of Paris. Felicette was not a pampered pet. She was a tuxedo stray, a ghost of the alleyways, surviving on scraps and her own sharp instincts. One afternoon, she was swept up off the streets by animal control and sold directly to the French government's Aviation Medical Research Center, known as CERMA. She was no longer a free, living creature. She was stripped of her autonomy and reduced to a sterile number. Si Batram Bon Muy Mot. She was thrust into a completely terrifying alien world alongside 13 other female cats. The process of turning a stray cat into an astronaut is a profound form of psychological and physical torture. Cats are apex predators of their size, but they are also prey. Their entire sense of safety relies on their ability to control their environment, to hide in the shadows, and to always know exactly where the ground is. The scientists took all of this away. For months, Si Batram Bon Muy Mot and the other cats were subjected to agonizing conditioning. They were locked into tiny, dark, claustrophobic compression chambers for hours at a time to simulate the isolation of a space capsule. But that was only the beginning. To prepare their bodies for the extreme violence of a rocket launch, the cats were strapped into massive, roaring centrifuges. These machines spun them at blinding speeds, subjecting their fragile bodies to crushing gravitational forces. A cat's inner ear, the biological marvel that allows them to always land on their feet, was pushed to the absolute breaking point. They were left dizzy, terrified, and completely disoriented, unable to understand why the world was violently spinning around them. And when the spinning stopped, the true horror of the medical program began. The scientists did not just want to see if a cat could survive space. They wanted to monitor its brainwaves while it happened. To do this, they performed highly invasive, brutal surgeries on all 14 cats. While Si Batram Bon Muy Mot was under anesthesia, surgeons drilled holes directly through her tiny skull. They permanently implanted heavy metallic electrodes deep into the soft tissue of her brain. Wires were left protruding from the top of her head, completely destroying her dignity and causing constant unnatural discomfort. Every time she tried to groom herself, every time she tried to act like a normal cat, the cold metal wires served as a cruel reminder that her body no longer belonged to her. Despite the endless trauma, the loud noises, and the invasive surgeries, Si Bachambon Muimot exhibited a remarkably calm demeanor. While the other cats panicked and fought back against their handlers, she simply endured it. She was quiet. She was compliant. She had the tragic patience of an animal that has realized fighting back is entirely useless. Because of her calm nature and because she hadn't gained too much weight, the scientists selected her to be the primary test subject. She was no longer just a number. The media gave her a name, Felicette. On the morning of October 18, 1963, in the scorching heat of the Sahara Desert in Algeria, the nightmare reached its climax. Felicette was strapped into a custom-built, agonizingly tight harness. She was locked inside a tiny, dark, cylindrical capsule mounted to the nose of a massive, liquid-fueled Veronique AG Mote rocket. There were no windows. There was no soft blanket. Just cold metal, wires attached to her brain, and the terrifying rumble of the rocket engines igniting beneath her. At exactly 8:09 a.m., the rocket launched. The acceleration was violently explosive. Within seconds, Felicette's fragile 5-pound body was crushed by 9.5 Gs of force. That is nearly 10 times the weight of normal gravity pressing down on her chest, making it almost impossible to draw a breath. The roar of the engines was deafening, a catastrophic sensory overload for an animal with hearing several times more sensitive than a human's. The electrodes drilled into her skull transmitted her sheer, absolute panic back to the scientists on the ground. Her heart rate skyrocketed. She was completely, utterly alone in the most hostile environment imaginable. The rocket tore through the atmosphere, climbing 97 miles into the sky, and then suddenly, the deafening roar stopped. The crushing weight vanished. Felicette entered the quiet, terrifying void of weightlessness. For 5 agonizing minutes, she floated in zero gravity. For a cat, an animal whose entire biological design is centered around gravity, balance, and knowing which way is up, this was the ultimate psychological terror. She was falling endlessly in the dark, unable to right herself, unable to find the ground. But the nightmare was not over. The capsule detached and began its violent plummet back to Earth. The deceleration forces slammed into her, tossing her tiny body violently against the constraints of her harness. Finally, the parachutes deployed, and the capsule slammed into the hard dirt of the Sahara Desert. When the recovery teams arrived and unbolted the heavy metal hatch, they found Felicette alive. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with unimaginable trauma, but she had survived. She had conquered the stars. She had endured the centrifuge, the scalpels, the crushing gravity, and the terrifying silence of the void. For a brief, fleeting moment, she was celebrated. The French media hailed her as a hero. She was photographed, her dark eyes looking cautiously at the camera, the thick metallic electrodes still jutting brutally from the top of her skull. She had given the scientists everything they asked for. She gave them their data. She gave them their national pride. Any decent human being would look at this tiny, exhausted creature and decide she had earned her retirement. She deserved a soft bed, a warm fire, and a quiet life, free from pain. But in the cold, calculated, deeply apathetic world of mid-century science, empathy did not exist. 2 months after her historic flight, the scientists made a completely unforgivable decision. They decided they wanted to physically examine the electrodes embedded in her brain. And to do that, they needed her dead. The cat who survived the terrifying vacuum of outer space could not survive the cruelty of human curiosity. She was strapped back onto the cold metal table. The lethal injection was administered. Her heart, which had beaten so frantically in the dark silence of the cosmos, was quietly stopped. They cut open her skull, extracted her brain, and threw the rest of her body away. But the final insult to Felicette was not her execution. It was her erasure. When countries printed commemorative stamps to celebrate the animal astronauts, they featured Laika the dog and Ham the chimp. But when France printed stamps to celebrate their space program, they didn't put Felicette on them. They printed a picture of a male cat and named him Felix, a cat that never even existed. They stole her life, they stole her brain, and then they completely erased her name from history. We look at our cats sleeping peacefully in the sunlight, purring when we stroke their fur. We know them as creatures of comfort, demanding respect and autonomy. It is utterly heartbreaking to realize that one of their kind was taken from the streets, stripped of her dignity, and shot into the cold void of space, only to be murdered by the very people who cheered for her return. Felicette was not a willing pioneer. She was a prisoner, a tiny, brave soul who danced among the stars, only to be betrayed in the darkest, most apathetic corner of the human heart.